This is the first session of our introduction to rabbinic literature. As I said, it's going to be advanced in terms of the analysis of the material, but it is introductory in the sense of going in stages from the beginning of rabbinic literature through the later halachic works, such as the Maimonides and Shulchan Aruch. The basis for the halachic interpretation of the Torah is what we call midrash halacha. The midrash halacha is the process of deriving the halacha from the text by using logical tools, which are called Middot. The midrash, the word midrash is misunderstood today, became a misnomer to refer to all the Agadah, to all the literature of Agadah that we have. So usually when people just say the word midrash, they think of the interpretation of the rabbis to the non-halachic parts of the Torah. But originally the term was midrash halacha, the midrash of halacha, and it referred to the specifically to the halachic part of the Torah, meaning that the rabbis looked at the verse and tried to derive the meaning of the verse from it by using logical methods, tools of analysis of the language, etc. Now, there is here, and from the beginning we have to put it on the table, a fundamental debate between the traditional view of the Midrash Halacha and the academic approach. The traditional view of Midrash Halacha is that the Midot, the tools by which we interpret the Torah, are just revealing the original meaning of the giving of the Torah, of the giver of the text. So when the Torah, when Hashem writes in the Torah, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, and the Midrash explains it in a certain way, this is what Hashem meant. This was the original meaning of the author of the text, the divine author of the text. The academic approach is varied, but in general looks at the midot as interpretive tools that the rabbis used either to establish a tradition that they already have, meaning they learned from their rabbis, from their masters, that this is how the pasuk is interpreted, or in some cases they did argue about the true meaning of the pasuk and decided by majority, using those tools on their way there. Now, the importance of that, of deciding between that view and the other, is how we view the decisions to which the rabbis arrived. The fear of the traditional, the Orthodox community is that if we question the divine origin of the midot, of the rabbinic interpretation, then we are going to undermine the whole structure that rests on these midot. Because we use the midot to interpret the pasuk, we use those interpretations to write the halacha, and later on gather it into the Mishnah, on which the Talmud is based, etc., etc. So if we pull one log out, this whole building is going to collapse. So there is a very strong defense system in place on the traditional side, rejecting any attempt to interpret the midot in any other way than divine knowledge that was handed down from one generation to another. Now, the academic approach does not necessarily undermine the authority of the rabbis. It just sees the rabbis as human beings, not the divine authors, who on one hand preserve the tradition and legislate according to the tradition that they received from their masters and generations before them, but also as legislators who create new halachot according to the changing needs of the time. If we accept it in that, if we accept that perspective, then that grants some authority to rabbis in later generations And in reality, that has been done constantly. Even when rabbis claim that they cannot go against the authority of previous generation, they did. But let us now go to the text and see what happens there. So the Midot, as the tools to interpret the Torah as we know them today, appear in a source that we have in front of us here, Sifra Baraita de Rabbi Ishmael 13 Midot. Now, this text was taken and inserted into the Siddur in some traditions. In the morning after you say Birkot Torah, you read the Korbanot, and then you read this Baraita de Rabbi Ishmael of the 13 Midot, where he lists 13 methods by which the Torah is interpreted. So let us go through them. But before we look, we go through the Midot, and an interesting detail has to be mentioned, and that is that the Baraita, this what is called Baraita de Rabbi Ishmael, like the external Mishnah of Rabbi Ishmael, is sort of a self-standing unit within the Midrash Halacha. Let me explain that. In Midrash Halacha, there are three bodies of work. Generally, the Midrash Halacha on the compilation of Midrash Halacha on the book of Shemot, which is called Mechilta or tractate, the compilation of Midrash Halacha on the book of Vayikra, which is called Sifra or the book, and it's called the book Sifra because it's the most comprehensive of all the compilation of Midrash Halacha because of the density of legal material in the book of Vayikra. And then there's the compilation of Midrash Halacha on Bemidbar and Devarim together called Sifrei, which means the books. So there's Mechilta, Sifra, and Sifrei. Those are the three units of main units of Midrash Halacha. The Mechilta, as we'll see later, has two versions. One is Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, one is Mechilta de Rabbi Akiva, or Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which represent two different schools of thought in the approach to Midrash Halacha. Now, the text that we're going to read now, called the Baraita de Rabbi Ishmael, is not an integral part of the Sifra. It's not an integral part of the Midrash Halacha. Had it been part of the Midrash Halacha, we would expect it to appear in the introduction to the very first work of Midrash Halacha, which is the commentary or the compilation on Shemot. But it does not. It appears before the compilation of Vayikra called Sifra, and it seems to be self-standing. And I'm going to argue that it was written and compiled a long time after the compilation of the Midrash Halacha itself, and we will be able to see that by looking at the Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, and searching for the appearances of all these midot that are mentioned in this Baraita. So we start. Rabbi Ishmael Omer, ב-13 midot HaTorah nidreshet. The Torah is interpreted with 13 different by 13 different tools, and he lists them here. Kal v'chomer, gezerah shava, binyan av v'chatuv echad, etc. I'm not going to read all of them because he's going to go systematically. The author is going to go systematically one by one and explain them. So let's go to that explanation. Mikal v'chomer ketzad, ויאמר השם אל משה, ואביה ירק בפניה, הלא תיכלם שבעת ימים, תיסגר שבעת ימים. קל וחומר לשכינה. So in the book of Midbar, we read that Hashem punished Miriam with leprosy, and Moshe prays to Hashem to heal Miriam. Hashem answers, had her father embarrassed her by spitting in her face, she would have been embarrassed for 7 days. So now she should consider herself embarrassed and quarantine herself for 7 days. So that's the Kal V'chomer. That is a fortiori, saying if we do this and that in a certain case, even more so in that case, which is more severe. In this case, in our story, the father embarrassing Miriam and Hashem embarrassing Miriam, to be embarrassed by Hashem is much worse. So she shouldn't behave in the same way as if her father has embarrassed her. The Gemara also asks, if the being embarrassed by God is more severe, she should quarantine herself for longer, for 14 days. And it answers, since we only arrived at that conclusion by logical deduction, we'll leave the outcome the same as the case that we've learned it from. So, had she been embarrassed by the father, it would have been 7 days. Now let it be 7 days. So that's Kal Vachomer. It's one of the most famous tools of interpretation. Then the next one is Gezerah Shava. Right? Gezerah Shava, Ketzad, נאמר בשומר שכר אם לא שלח, ונאמר בשומר חינם אם לא שלח. So the Gemara, the author here presents two psukim. We're not going to go now in depth into that, but basically the idea is that we have similar words in the description of two different laws, and because we have similar words, we can take details from one and apply them to the other. We say, just as in case A, where the words im lo shalach yado, if he did not extend his hand to take from the other, just as the law there is such and such, so the law in case B, where also these words are mentioned but not other details, will be such and such. This is, of course, I think that we could already see by just reading it superficially, this has a potential to go awry, because if we only compare two words that are mentioned in two words or two terms that are mentioned regarding two separate cases, where is the limit? Where do we stop? There are so many words that are repetitive, that appear in different laws and statutes throughout the Torah, that basically we could arrive at any conclusion we want. And this is really a problem that the Gemara and the rabbis grappled with. Then, מבניין אב וכתוב אחד, then we have a concept called binyan av. Binyan av וכתוב אחד, binyan av ושני כתובים. Binyan av literally mean a fatherly structure, or in other words, a fundamental structure. That the idea is that if we have a certain halacha with certain details, and then we have another halacha with some details that are similar between case A and case B, then we could expand case B to include all the details of case A. Because we see the similarity, we see just as in case A, we said that this is the halacha, so also in case B, which is similar in certain details to case A, we will say that this is the halacha. It sounds similar to Gezerah Shava, but it is different because it does not rely so much on the textual similarity, but rather on the essential similarity, the similarity of the content or of the concept of that halacha. And that splits between binyan av v'katuv echad, whether it is supported by one verse alone or by two verses, which we'll get into later. Then we have several rules that deal with klal uprat, a general rule, and then a detail that follows the rule. So, for example, the Gemara, the author gives us an example. Mina behema klal, mina bakar mina tzon prat. Behema, animals, bakar, cattle, tzon, sheep. Would actually include sheep and goats. And baklal ela masha baprat. What is the problem with the example? By the way, there's a problem, which is behema, animals, always mean domesticated animals and never wild animals. So if the Torah says mina behema, mina bakar, mina tzon, from the animals, and then it says cattle and sheep and goats, there are no other animals that should be included. So the question here is, it is redundant. Either the Torah tells me behema or bakar vatzon. You don't have to write all of them. And that is something that Rabbi Ishmael himself, who is the alleged author of this Baraita, I'm saying alleged because we'll see the how problematic is this assumption that Rabbi Shmuel wrote all these laws. The Rabbi Shmuel himself would reject it because he would say this is the normal way to write or to describe a law. We don't always try to distill the law to the minimal language possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't be readable. This rule is called Dibrat Torah Kilshon Bnei Adam, and we'll see it later. The Torah speaks the language of people. It speaks a normal, understandable, intelligible language. Miprat uklal ketzad. So we have klal uprat. First the general rule and then the details. Sometimes the Torah would first in the details and then the general rule, such as, for example, when we speak about guards or someone who's given a deposit to watch over, the Torah says, "Ki yiten ish el rayu hamor o shor ose prat v'chol behema lishmor klal." In this case, we're not talking about a sacrifice, as in the previous one, where the behema obviously refers only to kosher animals. We talk about a deposit. So if a man gives his friend to keep for him a donkey or an ox or a lamb, so those are details. V'chol behema lishmor, and all other animals. That's the klal. So here, this is an example of prat. Details are mentioned, and then the klal, the general rule, the general label. Then rule number 9, miklal, not number 9. Sorry, this is the fourth. מכלל שהוא צריך לפרט או מפרט שהוא צריך לכלל, whether the general rule needs the details or vice versa, meaning that without the details we would not fully understand the general rule. That's another example. Then we have 4 rules that refer to דבר שהיה בכלל ויצא מן הכלל. A concept that should have been included in the rule, but was taken out. This is what they called an exception, or yotzeh min haklal. So one of these, the first of this set of rules is davar she'aya bichlal ve'yatza min haklal lelamed. So it was part of the general rule, but then was singled out. Then כל דבר שהיה בכלל ויצא מן הכלל לטעון טעון אחר או טוען אחר שהוא כעניינו, that exception came to teach us something which is related to the general issue, or when it came to teach us something that is not related to the general issue. And then we discuss how we measure, we understand that teaching that the exception came to teach us. And right now we're just doing generally talking about all these rules. Then we have כל דבר שהיה בכלל ויצא מן הכלל לידון בדבר חדש. This exception comes to discuss something which is completely new, a novelty that never appears before. And then we have the last 3 Middot, דבר הלמד מעניינו, דבר הלמד מסופו, שני כתובים מכחישים זה את זה. דבר הלמד מעניינו is an issue which is not clear, but we understand by context, by what was written before it. דבר הלמד מסופו, same thing, lack of clarity, but we understand that we understand it better by things that are mentioned eventually, later on. And the last one is שני כתובים מכחישים זה את זה, עד שיבוא השלישי ויכריע ביניהם. 2 verses which contradict each other, and we cannot we cannot reconcile them until we find a 3rd verse to reconcile the discrepancy between the 2 verses. So this is the list of the 13 midot. We read it every day. We read it every day before some people read every day before the tefillah, and we assume that this is something that we also is built into the Talmudic system, right? That this is something that whenever you read Gemara, the rabbis always use all these tools when they interpret the Gemara. So I did a search and try to figure out how many times all these midot are mentioned in the Torah, in the Talmud. So if those are if these are the foundations of the interpretation of the biblical law, they should be scattered all over the Talmud, more or less with the same proportion, right? So here goes. So let's see. Kal v'chomer, the first midah, kal v'chomer, is mentioned in the Talmud 275 times. The second one, gzera shava, the comparison of two verses of two issues by a similar word that appears in both, appears in Talmud only 138 times, half the number of appearances of the Kal Vachomer of the a fortiori. Then we have the concept of Binyan Av, the fundamental structure, the fatherly structure that teaches us from case A to case B by the similarity of the details and not the language of the text. That one appears only 24 times in the whole Talmud, which is a huge difference. Kal Vachomer almost 300 times, Zera Shava about 140 times, and Binyan Av only 24 times. The group of Klal Uprat, Prat Uklal, Klal Uprat Uklal, meaning general rule first and then details first and general rule later, or general rule, then details, then general rule again, all together appear in all these three appear in the Talmud about 100 times. But the general rule followed by a detail appears 40 times. Prat Uchlal, first detail, then rule 17 times, and Klal Prat Uchlal, rule, detail, description, and then the rule again 40 times. This is how many times the Talmud discusses those issues. Then the next midot, davar she'ha bichlal ve'yatza min haklal lamed, the one became an exception, only appears. Before that, klal shu tzarich leprat, a detail that is that needs a general rule that needs the detail to explain it, only appears once in the Tanakh, in the Talmud. This one, prat shu tzarich klal, never appears in the Talmud. The one about the exception, yatza min haklal lelamed, the one that became an exception to teach us, appears only 5 times in the Talmud. And the last ones, this לטעון טעון אחר שהוא כעניינו doesn't appear. לדון בדבר חדש is mentioned once. הדבר הלמד מעניינו, an issue that is clarified by what was written before it, is mentioned 6 times. And the last two, דבר הלמד מסופו, an issue that is clarified by the end discussion, or 2 verses which contradict each other, are not mentioned at all in the Talmud. So we see greater disparity in the way these midot are used in the Talmud. We have 2 midot that really what we could call rule. Those are the ones that are on top. Kal Vachomer almost 300 times, Gzera Shava almost 140 times. We can add to them the Klal Uprat, Prat Uchlal, Klal Uprat Uchlal, the details or the rules in any constellation, but that's the general concept of looking at the general rule and the details in that rule, that all together appear about 100 times. All the rest are not in the Talmud. There are 3 midot that are mentioned in the Talmud: Kal Vachomer, Gzera Shava, and Klal Uprat. Binyan Av comes at number 4 with 40 appearances, and the rest are just 3 or 4 times throughout the Talmud. What does it tell us? It tells us that the Talmud does not use those midot as frequently as we think. And we're going to go back and ask ourselves, why is it that Kal Vachomer is used the greatest number of times, and then Gzera Shava, and then the others? But first, I want to go to the end of this baraita and see the example for the last rule that is mentioned. שני כתובים המכחישים זה את זה, עד שיבוא הכתוב השלישי והכריע ביניהם, 2 verses that contradict each other, and they will remain in contradiction until the third verse would come and reconcile or tell us what is the source of that difference. There we go. שני כתובים המכחישים זה את זה, עד שיבוא השלישי והכריע ביניהם. Two verses contradict each other, and they need the third one to reconcile, to explain the difference. כיצד? כתוב אחד אומר, וירד אדוני על הר סיני אל ראש ההר, and Hashem came down to Mount Sinai, to the top of the mountain, וכתוב אחר אומר, מן השמיים השמיעך את קולו לייסרקה. In another verse it is written, Hashem made you hear his voice from heaven to teach you morals and ethics. So what is the contradiction? One pasuk says that Hashem came down to the mountain, and another pasuk says that Hashem spoke to us from heaven. Is that really a contradiction? And is it something that has to do with halacha? Remember, we are talking about midrash halacha, so here we have a problem. We have the example that is given to explain the rule is first not part of the halachic discussion of the Torah. It's more prophetic, visionary, inspirational part of the Torah, but it's also really not a problem. Vayered Hashem al har Sinai is a metaphor. Hashem doesn't come down. Hashem is everywhere. Min hashamayim yishme'acha et kolo le'asereka. Again, Hashem talks to us from heaven. This is how we perceive it. What Bnei Israel saw, they saw a vision on Har Sinai, and they heard Hashem talking to them. For them, it was from heaven. There's no contradiction here. It's superficial. The contradiction is created in order to create a rule that is a nice rule that is perfect for sealing that list of 13 Middot, and maybe even to make it accessible and understandable to the commoners. So the example that is given is that of Har Sinai. What is the answer to that? I mean, how does it the matter settled? The third verse says, I spoke to you from heavens. That third pasuk, I spoke to you from the heavens, which doesn't really add anything to the second pasuk, min hashamayim, is interpreted here as melamed shirkina kadosh baruch hu shmei shamayim ha'alyonim. God brought down the supreme heavens all the way down to Mount Sinai and spoke to the people. V'chen amar David besefer Tehillim. David also mentions in the book of Tehillim, vayet shamayim vayirad v'arafel tachat raglav. He bent the heavens and came down, and mist was under his feet. Or those are all terms that are mentioned in Matan Torah. And from here we'll learn that there could be a situation where two verses contradict each other, but we could reconcile them by a third verse. So after that, that baraita adds this: Hillel HaZaken darash sheva midot lifnei ziknei betera. Hillel HaZaken darash, he was interpreting the text of the Torah, sheva midot lifnei ziknei betera, by using 7 rules when he was talking to the elders of the house of Betera. And what are those 7 rules? Kal v'chomer, the a fortiori; gzera shava, the comparison of 2 texts that have similar words; shnei ktuvim, 2 verses; klal uprat, details, the general rule and the details; v'kayotze bo b'makom acher, that's a rule that we didn't see before, a law that has something similar somewhere else, and that might be the binyan av, the fundamental structure, v'davar alamed minyano, and an issue that is clarified but by what is written before it. So let's count them. Kal v'chomer, gzera shava, shnei ktuvim, klal uprat, v'kayotze makom acher, v'davar alamed minyano. Those are 6. 1 is missing. Elu sheva midot שדרש הלל הזקן לפני זקני בתרה. Those are the 7 midot. Some people say that kal v'chomer are are broken into two, so those are considered two midot. So let me ask this question: when we go back to the Talmud, why is it that we have so many appearances of the uh, the rule of a fortiori in the Talmud? Right? We have, I mean, like I said, it's the proportion is not balanced. 300 times almost of the a fortiori, 140 of the Gzera Shava, comparing texts in words, between one text and another, and then the rest of the midot are hover around 2 or 3 around the 40s, and the rest are not mentioned at all. And the answer to that, I think, is that it is very simple, it's a very natural, logical process that we use all the time. And in Tanakh, it's very common. I'll have a couple of examples to share here from the Torah. One is in Genesis 44, 8. And you can look it up later in the English if you want. So, what is the story there? Yosef tried to frame his brothers and claim that they stole his golden his silver goblet. So his servant catches up with the brothers and tells them and accuses them of stealing Yosef's goblet. And they say, we would never do that. So again, this is Bereshit 44:8. They say, Hen kesef asher matzanu befi amtechotenu השיבונו אליך מארץ כנען, ואיך נגנוב מבית אדונך כסף או זהב. They say, we have found, the last time we visited here, we found money that was put by mistake in our bags. We could have claimed it as ours. We didn't have to return it to you, but we did. So if we have returned something that we could have kept as rightfully ours, how would we dare to steal from you? That proves our innocence. And that's a kal v'chomer. We didn't sin when we had the opportunity to do it. So even more so when it is a breach of the law and putting ourselves at risk. The other a fortiori that is mentioned in the Torah is the one that is mentioned in this Baraita in Bamidbar 12:14. After Miriam is punished with leprosy, Hashem tells him, "Ve'avi hayarok yarag befanea, halot tikalem shivat yamim." She has been embarrassed by me. Even if she was embarrassed by her father, she would close herself in, even more so when I'm the one embarrassing her. So that's another a fortiori. Another one appears in at the end of the book of Devarim, in chapter 31, verse 27. I know how stubborn you are, Moshe tells Bnei Israel. Even now that I am alive and I am your leader, you rebel against God. Even more so after I'm gone, after I die and I won't be here. So it's another a fortiori, a kal v'chomer in the Torah, and another one in the Tanakh. This is in Yirmiyahu, chapter 12, verse 5. Yirmiyahu complains to Hashem that he is being persecuted by his neighbors, by his family, etc. And Hashem answers with this: Ki et raglim ratzta v'yal'ucha, ve'ech tetachare et hasusim. You've been competing, racing, trying to race people who were running by foot, and they tired you. You weren't able to compete. Are you going to go to a competition against horses? And it says, and you trust the land where you live because it's peaceful, but what are you going to do when the Jordan River is going to flood the area? But the first part of the pasuk is a kal v'chomer. You can't win in racing against humans, how are you going to win when racing against horses? So in other words, what we see here is that the midah, this midah of kal v'chomer, does not necessarily have to come from a divine origin. It's a natural thing that we learn by uh, it's a natural understanding, interpretation of events, not even of text alone, even of events. This is a natural way to understand things. So let us sum up what I've said so far. The Midrash Halacha is the basis, is the foundation for the halachic literature, right? We assume that everything rests on Midrash Halacha. We assume that the rabbis use the tools of interpretive tools of Midrash Halacha to look at the verse and derive a conclusion. Um, we've seen that we have those 13 rules that mentioned by allegedly by Rabbi Ishmael in this baraita, which is self-standing and does not appear to be an integral part of the rest of the literature of Midrash Halacha. And we've seen some problems with the presentation of those midot, especially the last one that does not cite any halachic source, any halachic example to show what is the case of the two verses that contradict each other. Then at the end of that text, the that baraita says that Hillel HaZaken used the interpretive tools of Sheva Midot, only 7 and not 13. So that takes us to that story. Let us go now to this story of Hillel HaZaken and the Sheva Midot. And one more thing to add, we also reviewed the number of appearances of these Midot in the Talmud, and we've seen that only few of them are really used in the Talmud. So it's more towards the Sheva Midot. I could actually count that only 7 of these Midot are mentioned. It's the Kal V'chomer, Gzera Shava, Binyan Av, Klal Uprat, Davar Alamed Mi'anyano, and Klal Uprat Uchlal. So there are really around 7 interpretive tools that are mentioned in the Talmud, and that would suggest that a later author decided to expand the list from 7 to 13 to make it more authoritative, and broke down previous midot to several subcategories. So we're going to go in a second to the story of Hillel HaZaken and the Sheva Midot that he interpreted for Ziknei Betera. But before that, I'm going to stop the recording so people can ask questions. We'll continue with the story of Hillel and see what is it the Hillel HaZaken darash Sheva Midot lifnei Bnei Betera. What is the baraita here referring to? What was the story? So this appears here in the Tosefta, which is the officially is considered the external Mishnah, the Mishnayot that were not included by Rabban Gamliel when he edited the Mishnah. But we'll talk about it when we get to the discussion of the compilation of the Mishnah and the Tosefta. So here's the Tosefta. Shiva Dvarim darash Hillel HaZaken lifnei Ziknei Betera. The same thing as was mentioned in that text from the introduction to the Mishnah of the Baraita in the Sifra. But here's the original story. That is the story that appears in Masechet Psahim, Daf Samir Vav Amud Aleph, page 66a of the Babylonian Talmud. And if you find that it's difficult to see it in the with Hebrew or Aramaic only, you could go to Sefaria. It's and look it up in English. It's Pesahim 66a. Tanur Rabbanan. Halacha zo nit'alma mi bnei Betera. The rabbis thought this halacha was forgotten by Bnei Betera. Bnei Betera were the leaders of the Jewish people, and they forgot a certain law. So that already, even before we talk about the midot, is already alarming, right? Because if you can forget a law, you forget a halacha, and you are the leader of the community, What else did you forget? Were there other things that were forgotten and were never recovered? We don't know. But let's see what kind of halacha was forgotten. Is it something common or uncommon? פעם אחת חל 14 להיות בשבת, שכחו ולא ידעו אם פסח דוחה את השבת אם לאו. It once happened that the 14th of Nisan fell on a Shabbat. So the 14th of Nisan is the day in which the Pesach sacrifice is being offered, and it is referred to in the Torah as Hag Pesach. Whenever the Torah says Hag Pesach, it refers to the 14th of Nisan. And now this 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbat. שכחו ולא ידעו אם פסח דוחה את השבת אם לאו. So what the rabbis forgot, they didn't know if you're allowed to sacrifice the Pesach on Shabbat. To slaughter the animal, killing an animal and skinning it is something that one cannot do on Shabbat. Now they're not going to roast it on Shabbat. That will be done after nightfall on the 15th already, but they have to do it mib'od yom, before sunset. So they actually have to go Shabbat afternoon, or maybe from noon on, to the temple, bring their lambs and goats, and slaughter them on Shabbat. And the rabbis didn't know whether this is allowed or not. So again, this really raises serious questions about the continuity of tradition. How was it possible for the rabbis to forget whether Pesach is sacrificed on Shabbat or not? This should have been fundamental knowledge, but still they forgot it. Now, what is the basis of their doubt? Why are they doubting it? The basis for their concern is that there are two classes of sacrifices: the public sacrifice and the individual sacrifice. The public sacrifice is the one that is brought by the Kohanim, who represent the nation. It's the Korban Tamid, morning and evening, on Shabbat, Musafim, on Rosh Chodesh, etc. Those are set sacrifices that are brought throughout the year, every day, and additional on Shabbat and the holidays. And they were always brought in the temple, even on Shabbat. So it was clear that a public sacrifice can be brought on Shabbat. Then the other category is that of an individual korban, individual sacrifice, such as an individual who committed a crime, or and repents and brings a korban, or someone who decided to donate what is called korban todah. People who come to visit the temple and bring with them korban called shlamim to celebrate their presence in the temple, and so on and so forth. Or a leper that was healed, a nazir that concluded his term. All these people bring their individual korban. It's only theirs, and not it does not belong to other people. It's not a public one, and that does not override Shabbat. So those two things were clear to them. A public korban can be brought on Shabbat, an individual korban cannot be brought on Shabbat. But the Pesach has its own category. On one hand, it's an individual korban. Each family or each group of people has its own Pesach sacrifice. On the other hand, it's a public one because everybody does it on the same day. Or in other words, when we ask ourselves what makes a korban public or individual, the question would be, is it something that is brought by the whole nation on a designated day? And Pesach is brought by the whole nation on a designated day, seems to be public. But on the other hand, since it is eaten and offered by each family or each group separately, maybe it is an individual one and does not write Shabbat. Amru, they said, those Bnei Beterad, the people who didn't know what to do, said, כלום יש אדם שיודע אם פסח דוחה את השבת אם לאו. Do we have here anyone who knows whether Pesach overrides Shabbat or not? אמרו להם, they were told, Adam echad yesh she'ala miBavel. There is one man who came from Bavel. His name is Hillel the Babylonian. Sheshimesh shnei gdolei hador, and he studied under the two great scholars, Shmaya ve'Avtalion, ve'yodea, and he knows whether Pesach doche Shabbat. Now, that is interesting. The people who answer to Bnei Betara ask a question, does anyone know what is the halacha? And the answer is yes, someone knows the halacha. Okay, so you say it. If you know the halacha, why don't you ask Hillel and tell them? No, but there's a process here. Shalhu v'karu lo. So they sent to call for him, for that Hillel Bavli, Hillel the Babylonian. Amru lo, klum ata yodea im ha'pesach doche et ha'shabbat im lav. They ask, do you know whether Pesach overrides Shabbat or not? Amar lehem, v'chi pesach echad yeshnu shedoche et ha'shabbat. You think we have only one korban Pesach that overrides Shabbat? We have more than 200 such korbanot that override Shabbat. So he answers with the question. You ask me whether I can bring Pesach on Shabbat. He says, of course. We have, he says, do we only have one Pesach overriding Shabbat? We have hundreds of such Pesach, of such sacrifices, which override Shabbat. Amru lo, minayin lecha, how do you know that? Amar lahem, ne'emar mu'ado bePesach, ve'ne'emar mu'ado betamid. Here is the instance to which the other Baraita referred by saying that Hillel HaZaken darash midot lifnei bnei Betera. Remember that we read that the Baraita says Hillel HaZaken used the interpretive tools when he discussed the issue with bnei Betera. This is the case. He says, you know how I know that Pesach overrides Shabbat? Because it says the word mu'ed, you should bring the Pesach on time. The word mu'ed is used regarding Pesach, and the daily korban is also described with the word mu'ado. You have to bring the tamid be'mu'ado. So the Pesach should be brought on time, the tamid should be brought on time. Ma mu'ed ha'amur be'tamid dochet ha'shabbat. Just as the word mu'ed, on its time, that is mentioned regarding Pesach, regarding the daily korban, overrides Shabbat, so also the word on its time that is mentioned regarding Pesach overrides Shabbat. And that is, in a way, what I mentioned before, the public sacrifice overrides Shabbat, and Hillel says Pesach is a public sacrifice because it has a designated day. You must bring it on that day. Ve'od kal v'chomeru. He says it's an a fortiori. What is the a fortiori? Ma tamid she'en anush karet dochet ha'shabbat. Pesach she'anush karet eno din shedochet ha'shabbat. So he says, what is the a fortiori? There is a punishment called karet for one who does not celebrate Pesach, does not bring the korban. That punishment is understood as a untimely death without children, God forbid, and it applies only to korban Pesach. The only two positive mitzvot that one would be punished for not doing are korban Pesach and Brit Milah. But if one did not bring the korban tamid, let's say there was one kohen left and he was in charge of bringing the korban tamid and he did not bring it, he will not be punished. So Hillel says, if the daily sacrifice, which for failing to bring it one is not punished, can override Shabbat, korban Pesach, for which one would be punished if he didn't bring it, definitely can override Shabbat. That's their fortiori. Miyad oshivu barosh uminu nasi alehem. Immediately, or as a consequence, they made him the president. V'haya doresh kol hayom kulo bilchot Pesach, and he would expound on the laws of Pesach all day long. So this story presents Hillel HaZaken in a very positive light, right? The rabbis don't know the answer. They said, does anyone know? Oh, we have this Hillel, the Babylonian. He served the two great scholars of the generation. He knows the answer. They sent for him. He says, do you know the answer? He says, of course, A, B, one Gzera Shava, the other one Kal Vachomer. And immediately he rises to the top, he becomes the Nasi, and he expounds on the laws of Pesach all day long. This is the version in the Babylonian Talmud. The story doesn't end there. Hillel becomes a bit arrogant, and he tells the people who ask him the question, מי גרם לכם שאעלה מבבל ואהיה נשיא עליכם? העצלות שהייתה בכם, שלא שימשתם שני גדולי הדור שמעיה ואבטליון. You know why I became your president, the president of the Bedin? I'm not even, he says, I was not born in Israel, I came from Bavel, so I should have been secondary to you. But because you were lazy, and you did not serve, you did not study under Shmaya v'Avtalion, you lost your position. Amru lo, so they said, Rabbi, shachach velo hevi sakin me'erev Shabbat ma'u. What happens if one forgot to bring the knife on Erev Shabbat, and now you cannot carry it to the temple? Amar lahen halacha zo shamati v'shachachti. He says, I forgot this law. Well, interesting, because Hillel now is also forgetful. Ela anach lahen liYisrael im enam nevi'im b'nei nevi'im. He says, let the people be, if they're not prophets, they are the children of prophets. למחר, מי שפסחו טלה תוחבו בצמרו, מי שפסחו גדי תוחבו בין קרניו. On the following day, which was Shabbat, the people who needed to carry their knives to the temple, if their sacrifice was a lamb, they would stick the knife in the wool, in the lamb's wool, and if it was a young goat with the curled horns, they would stick the knife between the horns, which is very, a bit cruel, right? To think that the poor animal is carrying its own knife. But in any case, what happened was, is ראה מעשה ונזכר הלכה ואמר כך מקובלני מפי שמעיה ואבטליון. So once he saw the their action, he remembers the halacha. He says, oh, this is what you have to do, and I've received this by oral tradition from my masters Shmaya v'Avtalion. So all in all, this story is the sort of the first manifestation, the first presentation of the laws by which the Torah is interpreted. We don't have 7; we only have 2 rules that Hillel used, but even after he uses the rules, he needs to rely on oral tradition that is transmitted by the acts of the people. Like the rabbis are already gone, his master has passed away, he cannot ask them, he forgot the halacha, and he relies on the behavior of the people. So we're going to stop here today. But for next week, I will ask you to review the story again, this in Psahim 66a, and email me. I will send out the an outline of this class. I want people to look up also, if possible, the Yerushalmi, chapter 6 of the same tractate Psahim, the first halacha. With that, we're going to conclude today. I'm just stopping the recording.